Agent Marthe Synnekeert, the Belgian nurse who risked everything during World War I. Marthe Synnekeert, the nurse who spied Belgium 1915, a land once filled with quiet farming villages and cobbled streets, was now crushed under the heavy boot of German occupation. Families lived in fear, churches became outposts, and homes were stripped for the war effort. But within this suffocating silence, a young woman in a nurse's uniform carried a secret far greater than bandages and medicine. Her name was Marthe Synnekeert, a farmer's daughter, a medical caregiver, and one of the most extraordinary spies of the First World War. Early life. From student to nurse, Marthe was born in 1892 in West-Rozebeek, Belgium, into a modest farming family. She grew up with the values of hard work and resilience, traits that would later shape her path. By her early 20s, she had shown academic promise and went abroad to study medicine at the University of Ghent. When the war erupted in 1914, Marthe found her studies interrupted. Germany's armies swept across Belgium in a matter of weeks, bringing devastation to the countryside. Many towns were reduced to rubble and thousands of civilians were displaced. Marthe's own home was not spared. Seeking purpose, she redirected her path. Instead of continuing as a student, she donned the white apron of a Red Cross nurse, determined to heal the wounded regardless of nationality. It was in this decision, the choice to care for others in the midst of chaos, that her espionage career would unexpectedly be born. The occupied hospital. The Germans quickly realized Marthe's medical skills and placed her in a military hospital in Roulers near her home village. Here she treated German soldiers, many of them young, frightened, and injured. On the surface, she was just another nurse, obedient, quiet, and dedicated, but beneath her calm demeanor, Marthe carried a growing fury. She had seen villages burned, civilians shot, and churches desecrated. Each wound she treated only reminded her of the suffering inflicted by the very army she was now forced to serve, and yet this position gave her access. She overheard soldiers' conversations. She observed troop movements. She read documents left carelessly on desks. Most importantly, her apparent loyalty to the Germans meant no one suspected her. The perfect cover had fallen into her lap. Recruitment into espionage. In late 1915, Marthe was quietly approached by members of the British Secret Service and the Belgian resistance. They saw her potential, a young woman trusted by the enemy, able to move freely through occupied territory. Her mission was simple in theory, but perilous in execution: gather intelligence on German operations and pass it to the Allies. Marthe accepted without hesitation, for her spying was not just about patriotism. It was personal. Her homeland was bleeding, and she was determined to help stop the flow. Daily life as a spy. Spying was nothing glamorous. It meant constant vigilance, endless fear, and 1,000 small acts of courage. Marthe began secretly noting details she heard from German officers, references to troop deployments, ammunition deliveries, and fortifications. She memorized train schedules, studied maps, and even sketched German bunkers. She then passed this information to Allied intelligence through secret drop points, coded messages, and face-to-face meetings with resistance couriers. To the Germans, she was the diligent nurse who never complained. To the Allies, she was a lifeline of information, the web of resistance. Marthe was not alone. She was part of a sprawling underground network of Belgian civilians, priests, farmers, teachers, and shopkeepers, who risked everything to defy the occupiers. But unlike many, Marthe had the perfect disguise. Soldiers rarely suspected a woman in a nurse's apron. They often underestimated her, sometimes even confiding in her after a drink or during long nights at the hospital. This underestimation was her weapon, cut to reenactment. A German officer boasting over wine, Marthe listening quietly, her eyes sharp, as she memorizes every word. They thought she was harmless, but every careless whisper, every unguarded phrase was ammunition for the Allied cause. Moments of danger. But espionage is never without peril. Marthe faced brushes with exposure that could have ended with her execution. On one occasion, she was caught sketching a German ammunition dump. When questioned, she calmly explained that she was only drawing flowers nearby to pass the time. The soldiers laughed at her supposed innocence and let her go. On another occasion, she smuggled intelligence sewn into the hem of her dress. A German officer nearly discovered it during a search, but was distracted at the last moment by an urgent call. Each escape was a narrow miracle. Each day alive was a borrowed gift. Her greatest coup, the ammunition dump. One of Marthe's most celebrated acts of espionage was her role in destroying a German ammunition depot. She had carefully mapped its location and reported it to the Allies soon after. British bombers struck the site with devastating precision, crippling German supplies in the region. The Germans were furious. They suspected sabotage, but could not pinpoint the leak. Marthe, the quiet nurse who had treated their wounded, was beyond suspicion. She continued her work smiling politely, while inside she carried the satisfaction of striking a massive blow for Belgium. Recognition and medals for her bravery. Marthe Sinecert was later awarded numerous honors, including the Croix de Guerre by France, the Medal of Freedom by Britain, and recognition from Belgium itself. She was one of the few women to be so decorated during the war. But medals came with a cost. Behind every award lay years of danger, lies, and the constant fear of betrayal. Post-war reflections. From nurse to memoirist after the war ended in 1918, Marthe's life returned to something resembling normalcy. She resumed her medical studies and eventually became a doctor. But she never forgot her years as a spy. Later she published her memoir, I Was a Spy, which detailed her wartime experiences. The book became a sensation in the 1930s, later adapted into a film. Through her writing, Marthe revealed not just the mechanics of espionage, but the emotional toll, the isolation, the secrecy, and the moral burden of deception. Legacy of a nurse spy. Marthe Sinecert's story remains a testament to the power of ordinary people in extraordinary times. She was not a soldier with weapons or a commander with armies. She was a nurse with courage, and that courage changed the tide of war. Her legacy is twofold. As a healer, she saved countless lives. As a spy, she helped win a war. Both roles, contradictory, yet intertwined, defined her. She was not born a warrior. She never carried a rifle, but in the shadows of occupied Belgium, she became a weapon as sharp as any blade. With a steady hand and a courageous heart, Marthe Sinecert proved that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not with bullets, but with secrets. Life under occupation. The atmosphere of fear. To understand Marthe Sinecert's courage, you must first understand the world in which she lived. Belgium 1914 to 1918 was not just occupied, it was suffocated. The Germans imposed curfews, seized crops, and executed civilians suspected of resistance. Shops were emptied to feed the German army. Churches were looted for bells to be melted into artillery shells. Women walking to market were stopped and searched. Men were randomly conscripted for forced labor. In villages like Marthe's, children grew up under the shadow of German sentries stationed at every corner. For Marthe, this atmosphere of surveillance was both terrifying and useful. The constant German presence meant there were always careless soldiers to overhear, careless officers to observe. But it also meant she had to perfect her disguise as the loyal nurse, never showing the fire of rebellion that burned inside her. The nurse's mask, blending into the enemy's world. One of Marthe's greatest strengths was her ability to play a role in the hospital. She was patient, soft-spoken, even comforting to the very soldiers she despised. There are accounts of German officers praising her attentiveness, remarking that she was a model nurse. They never guessed that behind her sympathetic smile, Marthe was memorizing their conversations word for word. At times she used deliberate manipulation. A young officer might confide in her about an upcoming troop movement. Desperate to impress the beautiful nurse, Marthe would feign interest, perhaps offering a kind word, then carefully file away the information for allied ears. It was theater, and her stage was the hospital ward. Methods of espionage, codes, messages, and micro-sabotage. Unlike glamorous spy novels, real espionage in World War I was painstaking and subtle. Marthe used ingenious, often simple methods. Invisible ink. She sometimes wrote secret reports between the lines of seemingly innocent letters, using lemon juice that would reveal text when heated. Coded phrases. Messages about troop movements were disguised as recipes or shopping lists. A request for 3 sacks of flour might really mean 3 battalions on the move. Hidden compartments. Intelligence was smuggled inside hollowed-out loaves of bread or sewn into clothing hems. Observation notes. Marthe often hid tiny sketches of fortifications inside medical supply boxes. This was not just gathering intelligence, it was artistry under pressure. The psychological burden of deception. Living a double life takes a toll. For years, Marthe had to silence her true feelings, pretending to sympathize with the very men destroying her country. Imagine the strain. Laughing politely at a German joke, pouring wine for officers at a dinner, while silently replaying the screams of Belgian villagers burned alive only weeks before. At night, when she finally returned to her bed, the weight of her lies pressed heavy. Each day she wondered, did I smile too little? Did I linger too long when I looked at that map? Do they suspect me? The truth is, espionage corrodes the soul. Marthe carried that burden, knowing that one slip of the tongue, one suspicious glance could lead to a firing squad at dawn. The role of women in espionage. It is no coincidence that women like Marthe became some of the most effective spies of World War I. The German occupiers rarely suspected women. In their eyes, women were weak, apolitical, incapable of real danger. This arrogance created blind spots in German security. Blind spots Marthe exploited with precision. Her uniform, her youth, her gender, all became weapons in a war of perception. But that power came with risks. If exposed, female spies often faced harsher punishments than men, as the Germans considered them doubly traitorous, betrayers of both gender expectations and political loyalty. Marv lived every day knowing that capture would mean not just execution, but possibly brutal interrogation. A village's silent support. Though Marv operated with secrecy, she was not entirely alone. Her family and neighbors quietly aided her, sometimes at great risk. Farmers would pass along rumors of German patrols. Priests whispered coded blessings during confessions, signaling safe passage. Children carried tiny scraps of paper, hidden in school books, never realizing the importance of the words they delivered. Marv was the sharpest blade of the network, but behind her stood the entire will of an occupied people. Her intelligence impact, invisible but crucial. The true measure of Martha's espionage is not in spectacular battles, but in accumulated advantage. Every train schedule she passed on, every ammunition dump she marked, every whispered rumor she confirmed, all of it flowed into the larger intelligence puzzle. Allied commanders armed with this mosaic of information could anticipate German strategy, strike where it hurt most, and save countless lives. It is easy to overlook such contributions because they are invisible, but without spies like Marv, the Allied armies would have fought in darkness. The Germans' growing suspicion. By 1917, German counterintelligence had begun to realize that their lines were being compromised. They intensified searches, tightened security, and infiltrated resistance groups. Martha's activities grew even more dangerous. She had to adapt quickly, changing her drop points, altering her codes, even feigning illness to avoid suspicion. When German officers began scrutinizing the hospital staff more closely, still she continued to stop, meant to surrender. After the guns fell silent when the war ended in 1918, Marv faced a strange emptiness. For years her life had been defined by secrecy, danger, and purpose. Now, with peace declared, she returned to her studies, finished her medical degree, and built a new life. But the echoes of war never left her. She later married, raised a family, and published her memoirs. Yet the stories she shared were carefully chosen, fragments of truth shaped into a narrative for readers. The deepest scars, the nights of fear, the faces of those she could not save, those remained locked in her heart. Cultural impact. A spy in literature and film. Martha's memoir, I Was a Spy, published in 1932, became a sensation across Europe and America at a time when the world was still grappling with the trauma of the Great War. Her story offered a blend of heroism, intrigue, and patriotism. The memoir was later adapted into a 1933 British film, further immortalizing her exploits. For many, Martha became the prototype of the female spy. Courageous, cunning, and underestimated. Her fame also raised questions. How many untold stories of women like her had been lost? How many silent heroes never received medals, never wrote books, never had their names remembered? Legacy. A torch for future spies. Martha's influence extended beyond her own era. Intelligence agencies in World War II studied the role of women in espionage, citing her effectiveness as a model. Her story became part of the training material for later female agents of the British So in the American OSS, Virginia Hall, Odette Sansom, Nancy Wake, all legendary World War II spies, walked in a path first illuminated by women like Martha Sinecaert. Martha Sinecaert's story is not one of dramatic gunfights or cinematic escapes. It is quieter, subtler, and perhaps more human. She fought her war with observation, patience, and deception. She fought it with the tools of a nurse, a steady hand, a calm demeanor, and a willingness to heal even as she plotted destruction. Her life reminds us that espionage is not always about grand gestures. Sometimes it is about the daily grinding courage to keep going, to keep lying, to keep fighting in silence until the war is won. She was a daughter, a nurse, a spy, and a survivor. Martha Sinecaert lived not to be remembered as extraordinary, but simply as someone who did what had to be done, and in doing so she became extraordinary. Agent Josephine Baker, one of the most unique spies in history, because she used her fame, beauty, and stage performances as her greatest weapon against the Nazi cinematic script. Josephine Baker, the entertainer who danced for freedom to the world. Josephine Baker was a star, a singer, a dancer, a sensation who lit up the stages of Paris and enchanted audiences across continents. But behind the glittering costumes and the dazzling smile lay a secret. Josephine Baker was also a spy, and her stage was not only the theater, but the battlefields of World War II. From St. Louis to stardom, Josephine was born in 1906 in St. Louis, Missouri, into poverty and racial segregation. Her early life was marked by hardship, working as a maid, dancing on street corners for coins, surviving hunger and humiliation. But Josephine had something no poverty could crush: a fire. She danced with a joy so infectious that by the age of 15 she was performing in vaudeville shows. By 19 she sailed across the Atlantic to Paris. There she became an overnight sensation. Paris loved her freedom, her wild energy, her exotic style. In 1926 she shocked and thrilled audiences by dancing in a skirt made of artificial bananas. The Black Venus they called her, but Josephine was more than a performer. She was a woman who understood power, and when war came to France she would wield that power in ways no one could have imagined. When the world went to war in 1939, Europe stood on the brink of destruction. Nazi Germany's shadow spread across the continent, and soon France itself would fall under occupation. Josephine, who had made Paris her home, could have fled. She had wealth, fame, and an estate in the French countryside, but she refused to abandon the country that had embraced her when her own homeland, America, had only offered her prejudice. She declared, "France made me who I am. I will give my life for her, if I must." And so Josephine Baker, the world's most famous entertainer, joined the French resistance, a star with access. Josephine's fame was her perfect cover. While soldiers and ordinary citizens were scrutinized by German officers, Josephine was welcomed into high society. She attended embassy parties, military gatherings, and receptions, where Axis officers mingled with diplomats. Her charm disarmed them. Her laughter filled the room. No one suspected that behind her flirtatious smile she was memorizing troop movements, military strategies, and conversations. And she had a genius method of transporting intelligence. Her sheet music. Josephine often traveled with stacks of musical scores. To the untrained eye they were harmless notes and lyrics, but hidden between the staves of music in invisible ink were some of the most valuable secrets of the war. Espionage on tour, her resistance work took her across Europe and North Africa. With her orchestra she staged concerts in neutral countries like Portugal and Spain. While others saw a glamorous tour, Josephine was carrying information for Allied intelligence, messages about German troop placements in Africa, notes on Axis supply routes, lists of collaborators in Lisbon, a city crawling with spies. She passed coded intelligence to British officials. In Morocco she relayed information to free French leaders. Her fame gave her immunity. Border guards rarely searched the trunks of the great Josephine Baker. Even Nazi officers, enchanted by her celebrity, waved her through checkpoints. And so, under the guise of an entertainer, Josephine became one of the most effective couriers of the resistance, courage in the face of danger. But her life was never without peril. In 1940, when the Germans occupied Paris, Josephine was questioned multiple times about her loyalties. Rumors swirled that she was tied to the resistance, yet she played her part flawlessly. She charmed officers with laughter even as she concealed coded messages in her underwear or taped microfilm to the inside of her dresses. At her chateau in the Dordogne she sheltered resistance fighters, supplied them with food, and helped hide Jews fleeing persecution. Her estate became both a sanctuary and a nerve center of espionage. One resistance fighter later recalled, "She was more than a performer, she was a soldier without a gun, and her courage was infinite." The risk of discovery. Imagine the danger. A famous star constantly in the public eye, traveling across borders. If even one border guard had examined her sheet music under heat, if one officer had searched her dresses too carefully, Josephine could have been executed as a spy, and yet she never flinched. Her defiance was all the more remarkable considering her health during the war. Josephine suffered from illnesses, including pneumonia and later a miscarriage. At one point, she was bedridden for months. Still, she used her time to continue assisting the resistance, using her fame as both shield and weapon. The war's end. Recognition at last. When the war ended in 1945, Josephine Baker did not return to the stage. Immediately she walked instead among the ruins of a liberated France, where her work had helped tip the scales. General Charles de Gaulle himself awarded her the Croix de Guerre and the Recette de la Resistance, two of France's highest military honors. She also received the Médaille de la Resistance. Later she would be named a Chevalier of the Legion of Honor, France's greatest distinction. Josephine, the girl once dismissed in America as nothing more than a colored performer, was now a war hero in new battle, civil rights. After the war, Josephine's mission did not end. She turned her attention to the fight for racial equality. Returning to the United States, she was shocked to find segregation and discrimination still deeply entrenched. She refused to perform for segregated audiences, famously walking out of a club in Miami. When she learned black patrons were being excluded in 1963, she stood alongside Martin Luther King Jr. at the March on Washington, wearing her French resistance uniform, addressing thousands. Her voice rang out not as a performer, but as a soldier of justice. Later life. The Rainbow Tribe. Josephine's later years were as remarkable as her wartime exploits. She adopted 12 children from different nationalities, religions, and backgrounds, calling them her Rainbow Tribe. Her dream was to prove that people of all races could live together in harmony, a living example of unity. Though her finances often struggled under the weight of caring for so many, Josephine never abandoned her vision. In April 1975, Josephine Baker returned to the stage in Paris for a sold-out performance celebrating her 50-year career. The reviews were glowing, crowds adored her once more, but only days later she suffered a cerebral hemorrhage and passed away at the age of 68. France honored her with a state funeral. More than 20,000 people lined the streets of Paris to bid farewell. Soldiers carried her coffin draped in the French flag through the city she had loved and defended. She became the first American-born woman to receive full French military honors. At her burial, a life of many stages, Josephine Baker was many things: a dancer, a singer, a mother, a civil rights activist, but above all she was a fighter. She fought the Nazis with courage, she fought racism with defiance, and she fought for love and unity with her very life. The world remembers her as a star of the stage, but history must also remember her as what she truly was: a warrior in sequins, a spy who danced for freedom. The unseen weapons of a star. Josephine Baker's espionage career was not just about moving information across borders. It was also about weaponizing her presence. Her charm, beauty, and celebrity status created an invisible armor where most spies relied on disguises. Josephine relied on visibility. She understood something that many agents never did: that sometimes the best place to hide a secret is in plain sight. At embassy parties, she was not simply overhearing conversations. She was guiding them. She would dance, sing, and laugh, drawing powerful men into her orbit. Once their guard was down, she'd ask just the right questions, masking her intelligence work with playful curiosity. One of her fellow resistance members recalled, Josephine could make a general believe he was simply entertaining her with stories of troop movements, when in reality he was betraying his entire command. The music of Spies, her sheet music smuggling, is legendary, but there's more to the story. Josephine's orchestra often traveled with trunks of instruments, costumes, and boxes of music. Within those items she concealed microfilm-coated notes and invisible ink letters. Historians have pointed out that she also relied on her musicians. Several of them were secretly resistance operatives, using their roles as harmless performers to help spread intelligence. Josephine was not a lone wolf. She was a ringleader of a carefully orchestrated spy network disguised as a cabaret troupe. Imagine a glamorous Parisian show filled with music, feathers, and sequins, all while beneath the laughter, life and death intelligence was being exchanged. It was espionage staged as entertainment. Life in exile. Morocco as a base of resistance. After the Nazis invaded France, Josephine retreated to her estate in Dordogne. But when suspicions grew, she fled to Morocco in 1941. Casablanca became her second base of operations. There Josephine officially performed for troops and officials, but behind the curtain she worked as a liaison between resistance cells and free French officers. Her villa in Morocco became a hub where couriers could stop, regroup, and pass along intelligence. This period of her life highlights something important. Josephine was not just smuggling information across borders, she was building networks. She became a connector, someone who linked different resistance groups, using her fame as cover. Espionage and identity. One of the most fascinating aspects of Josephine's spy career was how it intersected with her identity. She was a black woman, an American expatriate, and a performer in Nazi ideology. She was considered inferior, yet ironically her very celebrity made her untouchable. Josephine turned that contradiction into her greatest advantage. She made herself larger than life, so much so that German officials hesitated to confront her directly. But she never forgot the precariousness of her position. At any moment she could have been accused, arrested, and executed. This duality, adored on stage, hunted in shadows, was the paradox of Josephine Baker. Resistance as performance. Josephine's life blurred the line between theater and espionage. Historians often describe her work as a form of theatrical resistance. On stage she embodied fantasy in her spy work. She staged deception. Every gesture, every smile, every costume was carefully calculated. Even her illnesses, real or exaggerated, sometimes worked as cover, buying her time, deflecting suspicion, or explaining her travels. It's no coincidence that intelligence agencies today study Josephine's methods as examples of social engineering, the art of manipulating trust and perception. She was doing it decades before the term existed. Symbol of women in espionage. While Josephine is often remembered for her banana skirt and her glamour, her true contribution lies in how she expanded the image of what a spy could be. Before her, espionage was often imagined as a man world. Trench coats, code books, and pistols. Josephine shattered that mold. She showed that femininity itself could be a weapon, that charm and beauty could gather intelligence just as effectively as a gun or a code machine. She inspired generations of women in intelligence services, proving that courage and wit knew no gender. The shadow of surveillance. Josephine's war did not end with the defeat of the Nazis. In fact, in some ways her post-war years mirrored her espionage life during the 1950s. As she became more outspoken about civil rights in the United States, she came under surveillance by the FBI and other agencies. To American authorities, Josephine's links to leftist groups and her criticisms of segregation made her suspicious. Incredibly, the woman who had risked her life fighting fascism in Europe was now monitored as a potential subversive in her homeland. Declassified FBI files show that J. Edgar Hoover personally kept track of her activities. This surveillance reflected a cruel irony. Josephine, who had once been a spy against tyranny, was now treated as a threat by the very country of her birth. The emotional cost of double lives. Every spy carries a burden. For Josephine, the warriors were glamorous in story, but grueling in reality. She often faced exhaustion, illness, and fear. The constant need to play roles, entertainer by day, secret courier by night, took its toll. Letters and memoirs suggest that she sometimes felt torn between her duty to the resistance and her longing for a normal life, yet she never wavered. She accepted that her gift, her fame, carried a responsibility larger than herself. This emotional weight makes her story deeply human. Behind the sequence was a woman who lived with fear, sacrifice, and loneliness. Why Josephine's espionage mattered strategically. Some critics have downplayed Josephine's spy career, calling her more of a courier than a true agent, but such claims miss the bigger picture. Josephine's role was not just about carrying messages. It was about creating pathways of trust. She made it possible for vital intelligence to move from occupied territories to allied leaders. Her celebrity opened doors that would otherwise have remained shut. In war, information is as valuable as weapons, and Josephine's intelligence contributions saved countless lives by preventing German advances and strengthening Allied operations in North Africa. The power of myth. Perhaps what makes Josephine Baker unforgettable is the way her story blends fact and myth. Some accounts exaggerate her exploits, painting her as a near superhuman spy. Others underplay them, insisting she was just a courier. But in truth, both extremes reveal something important. Josephine understood the power of story. Just as she controlled her narrative on stage, she controlled her legend in espionage. Even if certain details of her missions are lost, the symbolic power of Josephine as a resistance fighter remains undeniable. She became a living myth, and myths inspire revolutions. Legacy in intelligence culture. Today, Josephine's methods are studied in spy schools. The idea of using celebrity charm and public persona as cover remains relevant. Intelligence agencies teach about her ability to blend performance with espionage, a fusion of art and war. In 2021, Josephine Baker was honored by being inducted into the Pantheon in Paris, France's most sacred resting place for national heroes. She became the first black woman to be enshrined there. This final honor sealed her legacy, not just as an entertainer, not just as a spy, but as a symbol of courage and defiance. The dancer who fought Josephine Baker was a woman of contradictions, glamorous yet dangerous, adored yet hunted, fragile yet unbreakable. She used the stage to charm the world and the shadows to help save it. Her greatest performance was not in sequins or feathers, but in silence. The silence of secrets carried across borders, hidden in sheet music guarded behind her smile. She danced for joy, she danced for survival, but above all, Josephine Baker danced for freedom. Chevalier Dayan, the diplomat in disguise, a diplomat who dined with kings, negotiated with emperors, and slipped through Europe. Escorts in masks of silk and lace. Some called them a man, some swore they were a woman. All agreed they were dangerous. This is the story of Chevalier Dayan, the spy who turned identity itself into the greatest disguise. Born in 1728 in Tonnerre, France, Charles Genevieve Louis Auguste André Timothy d'Eon de Beaumont, later known as Chevalier d'Eon, grew up in a world obsessed with appearances, honor, and intrigue. From a young age, d'Eon showed brilliance in languages, law, and politics. By their 20s, they had already caught the attention of French officials. What set d'Eon apart wasn't just intelligence. It was adaptability. They could blend into any circle, shifting tone, accent, and mannerisms with ease. The French King Louis XV saw potential. He secretly recruited d'Eon into his covert spy network, the Secret du Roi. This was a shadowy diplomatic corps that worked not for the government, but personally for the king. Its mission: advance France's hidden interests, even if it meant deceiving France's own ministers. d'Eon's first mission sent them across Europe, particularly to Russia, and here the legend of disguise began. Russia in the mid-1700s was a land of courtly intrigue. The throne was contested, alliances were shifting, and whispers in palace corridors could decide the fate of empires. According to persistent rumors, never fully proven yet never disproven, Dion entered Russia. Disguised as a woman, some accounts claim they infiltrated the court of Empress Elizabeth by posing as a French lady-in-waiting. In this role, Dion allegedly gained the Empress's trust, learning secrets that no male diplomat could access. Imagine the scene. Lavish gowns, glittering jewels, candlelit banquets. Hidden in this theater of power was a spy, smiling, bowing, listening. Every glance, every whispered phrase became intelligence for the French crown. Whether or not the disguise story is entirely true, one thing is certain. Dion excelled at espionage in Russia, negotiating key alliances that helped France. Their performance in this shadowy game earned them respect and suspicion. After Russia, Dion's career shifted to England. Officially, they were appointed as a French diplomat in London. Unofficially, they remained a spy for Louis XV. Here, Dion's role was twofold. One, represent France in diplomatic negotiations, to secretly gather intelligence on Britain's military plans, especially concerning a possible invasion of France. London's glittering salons, smoky clubs, and royal courts became Dion's stage. With wit, elegance, and razor-sharp intellect, they charmed British aristocrats and collected secrets with surgical precision. But life as a double agent was perilous. Dion knew too much. They carried within them not just diplomatic knowledge, but maps, invasion plans, and confidential codes that could change the balance of power in Europe. It was in London that Dion's life took its strangest, most controversial turn. Whispers began to spread. Was the Chevalier truly a man, or were they secretly a woman in disguise? These rumors ignited one of the most bizarre chapters in espionage history. Bets were placed in London gambling halls on Dion's true sex. Newspapers speculated endlessly. Aristocrats debated, sometimes even violently, over whether Dion was male or female. Far from weakening Dion, this mystery gave them power. They learned to manipulate the uncertainty, using it as yet another layer of disguise. No one could fully pin them down. In espionage, uncertainty is the greatest shield. Eventually, after years of speculation, Dion declared publicly that they were in fact a woman. A revelation that shocked Europe. They began dressing permanently in women's clothing, though the debate over their identity continued until their death. Behind the scenes, another drama unfolded. Dion possessed secret papers, highly sensitive documents from the secret du Roi, that detailed France's plans for war against England. These papers were so explosive that their release could have destroyed governments. When France tried to recall Dion, the Chevalier refused, threatening to publish the documents if betrayed. This was not just espionage. It was political blackmail at the highest level. For years, Dion held both France and England hostage with the threat of exposing secrets. This standoff turned Dion into both a legend and a liability. Eventually, the French crown reached a compromise. Dion was allowed to remain in England, officially recognized as a woman. They spent the rest of their life there, living quietly, but always surrounded by an aura of mystery. By the time of their death in 1810, the world was still divided. Was the Chevalier truly male, female, both, neither? An autopsy later concluded that Dion's body was anatomically male, but by then the legend had far surpassed biology. Chevalier Dion's life was about more than espionage. It was about the power of identity. They demonstrated that gender-like disguise could be a tool in the art of deception. Where others wore masks, Dion lived one. Where others relied on codes, Dion relied on ambiguity. In a world where spies were shadows, Dion became something else, a mirror. People saw in them what they wanted to see, and that was their genius. The enigma lives on. Were they man, woman, both, or neither? Were they a loyal diplomat or a traitor holding nations hostage? Were they a hero or a scandal? The truth perhaps lies not in the answer, but in the disguise itself. For Chevalier Dion showed the world that the greatest weapon a spy can wield is the mystery of who they are. Before Dion became a legend of gender and espionage, they were already renowned. As a master fencer in 18th century Europe, fencing was not just a sport. It was a marker of honor, nobility, and survival. The Chevalier could parry, thrust, and strike with unmatched elegance. They competed in high society duels, defeating celebrated swordsmen of France and England alike. Crowds gathered to watch this curious figure in silk gowns and powdered wigs duel with the grace of a ballet dancer and the precision of a soldier. One famous match in London pitted Dion against the fencing champion of the city. The scene was electric. A hall filled with nobles, gamblers, and courtiers eager to see if the lady diplomat could truly Fight like a man. Dion wearing a satin dress took the floor. With each strike of the blade, gasps filled the room, and when the opponent finally yielded, the audience erupted. To the world, this was more than a duel, it was a theatrical display of paradox. A figure who defied categories, mastering both the salon and the battlefield. For Spies, perception is everything. Dion used fencing not only as self-defense, but as psychological theater, crafting a persona that nobody could dismiss. London society in the 1760s was intoxicated by Dion's presence. Rumors of their true sex became a national obsession. Taverns buzzed with speculation. Aristocrats debated late into the night, but it was in the gambling halls where the mystery became most profitable. Bookmakers set odds. Was the chevalier male or female? Bets were placed across the city. Fortunes won and lost on whispers of gossip. This phenomenon was unprecedented. No other spy in history had ever become the subject of such widespread betting. Dion's very existence became a commodity, a game of chance played in smoky rooms, lit by candlelight, and Dion knew this. Rather than deny or confirm, they cultivated the ambiguity. By refusing to reveal, they controlled the narrative, turning the city's obsession into a shield. No British minister could dismiss them as irrelevant. Their name was on every lip, and espionage attention can be deadly, but Dion twisted it into power. The Chevalier was not just a spy. They became a cultural phenomenon. Their story inspired satirical cartoons, poems, pamphlets, and plays. London printmakers sold caricatures of Dion in both men's and women's clothing. Some mocked them, others celebrated them, but all spread the myth further. Even fashion was touched. Stories claim that women in London began imitating Dion's style of dress, mixing masculine tailoring with feminine elegance. Men too jokingly donned wigs and gowns at masquerades, calling it the Dion look. Through fashion satire and gossip, Dion blurred the line not only between male and female, but between private life and public spectacle. They were in a sense the first celebrity spy. The deeper layer of Dion's power lay in the papers they carried. Hidden away, sometimes in London trunks or disguised among personal letters, were documents that detailed France's invasion plans against England. This meant that at any moment Dion could ruin both nations. To France, this was terrifying. To England, it was tempting. Both sides courted Dion, bribed them, threatened them. Here we see espionage at its most dangerous, not in the shadows of battlefields, but in the delicate balancing act of possession. Dion wasn't just a spy anymore. They were a living vault, a walking archive of secrets, too dangerous to be silenced, too valuable to be ignored. What makes the Chevalier unique is not only their role as a spy, but their embodiment of duality in every sphere. Gender, living as both man and woman. Loyalty, serving both crown and self-interest. Role, diplomat by day, secret agent by night. Reputation, celebrated as a hero, mocked as a scandal. This duality wasn't accidental, it was strategic. In espionage, adaptability means survival by being unreadable. Dion became untouchable. But like many spies, the end was less glamorous than the legend. After decades in London, Dion fell into financial ruin. The wagers, the dinners, the salons, they faded. The French Revolution erupted. Kings fell and the old world of silk and ceremony crumbled. Dion, once the toast of Europe, now lived in poverty, renting small rooms and surviving on odd jobs. Yet even in decline, the legend persisted. Visitors came to gawk, to ask questions, to confirm the truth about this most mysterious of spies. When Dion died in 1810, doctors finally examined the body, announcing that the Chevalier was anatomically male, but by then the revelation was almost irrelevant for the world. Dion had already lived as both, and the legend was more powerful than the fact. Today historians debate Chevalier Dion. Were they truly using gender as espionage cover? Or was it a personal identity later weaponized by circumstance? Some view Dion as one of history's first examples of gender-fluid identity in espionage. Others see them as a skilled manipulator who recognized that ambiguity itself could be a shield. What is certain is this: Dion has become a symbol. For intelligent scholars, they represent the earliest documented case of psychological espionage, the art of controlling not just information but perception. For activists and historians, Dion embodies the fluidity of identity. Centuries before modern conversations on gender began in the game of spies, disguises are weapons, but Chevalier Dion wielded the greatest disguise of all: their own life. A fencer who dueled in gowns, a diplomat who held nations hostage, a spy who lived as both man and woman. The Chevalier remains an enigma, a shadow between categories, a figure who forced the world to ask, what is truth? What is identity? And in that question lies their greatest triumph. For as long as history debates, the Chevalier lives on. Agent Elizabeth Bentley, one of the most controversial and impactful spies of the Cold War. She began as a devoted Soviet agent, but later flipped sides, becoming a U.S. government informant, whose testimony shook Washington and fueled the Red Scare. Elizabeth Bentley, the spy who switched sides. Washington, D.C. -1945. A woman in her late 30s, nervous but determined, walks into the offices of the FBI. Her name is Elizabeth Bentley. To the outside world, she seems ordinary, almost forgettable. But in her mind swirls a storm of secrets. The names of dozens of Soviet agents, the details of clandestine meetings, and the hidden pathways through which Moscow reached into the very heart of the United States government. In a single confession, Bentley will turn from loyal Soviet courier to FBI star witness, and from obscure spy to one of the most infamous figures of the Cold War. Elizabeth Bentley was born in 1908. In New Milford, Connecticut, the daughter of conservative middle-class parents, she seemed destined for a quiet life. But early on, Bentley demonstrated sharp intelligence, ambition, and a hunger for something bigger than the world around her. She attended Vassar College, excelling in languages and literature. She later studied in Florence, Italy, where she developed a fascination with politics. During the turbulent rise of Mussolini, fascism repelled her. Its rigid nationalism and brutality horrified her. But communism at that time seemed to offer an alternative, a vision of equality, justice, and a better world. Back in the United States during the Depression, Bentley was swept into the world of leftist activism. By the 1930s, she was recruited into communist organizations, attending meetings, translating documents, and gradually drifting closer to the shadowy world of Soviet intelligence. She was not a woman born into espionage. She was pulled by ideology, by passion, and by the promise of belonging to something greater. But ideology has a way of demanding loyalty, and once Elizabeth Bentley stepped into the Soviet orbit, there was no turning back. In the early 1940s, Bentley's life changed dramatically. She was recruited by Jacob Golos, a Soviet agent, and one of the most influential communist operatives in America. Golos became her lover, her mentor, and her gateway into espionage. Working alongside him, Bentley became a trusted courier. She managed networks of American agents who supplied intelligence to Moscow, engineers, bureaucrats, and even individuals inside U.S. government agencies. Her job was dangerous, but deceptively simple: receive classified material from contacts, deliver it to handlers, and ensure the steady flow of secrets to Soviet intelligence. Bentley later confessed to handling material from more than 80 individuals, some of whom were embedded in highly sensitive offices, including the U.S. Treasury, the State Department, and the War Production Board. She was not a field agent with gadgets and disguises. She was something far more vital: the human pipeline, the courier who kept the arteries of Soviet espionage alive on American soil. But espionage is rarely about ideology alone. For Bentley, it was also about Jacob Golos. Their relationship blurred the line between love and mission. She adored him, trusted him, and through him found a sense of purpose. When Golos died suddenly in 1943, Bentley's world collapsed. She was devastated both personally and professionally. Without him, she felt adrift, vulnerable, and increasingly disillusioned with Moscow's demands. It was in this fragile state that she began questioning her role. The Soviets treated her coldly, expecting her obedience without affection. The glamour of communism faded into the reality of manipulation, and in the shadows, she began to consider the unthinkable: betrayal. In August 1945, Elizabeth Bentley walked into an FBI office and delivered one of the most explosive confessions in American history. She described her years of service as a courier for Soviet intelligence. She named names, detailed meetings, and outlined the networks she had managed. The FBI at first was stunned. Could this woman be trusted? Was she exaggerating? Or was this the breakthrough they had been waiting for? Within weeks, Bentley's information launched massive investigations. Federal agents tracked dozens of suspected spies, many of whom panicked, fled, or fell silent. With one decision, Elizabeth Bentley transformed herself from servant of Moscow to servant of Washington. But the price of this transformation would be her own reputation, her credibility, and ultimately her peace. By the late 1940s, Bentley became the star witness in congressional hearings on communist infiltration. She testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee and the Senate, accusing dozens of individuals of secretly working with Soviet intelligence. Her testimony electrified the nation. Newspapers splashed her face across front pages, dubbing her the Red Spy Queen. But controversy quickly followed. Some hailed her as a patriot who saved the nation from infiltration. Others painted her as unstable, a woman motivated by bitterness, loneliness, or a desire for attention. Many of those she accused denied everything. Lives and careers were destroyed, sometimes on the strength of her words alone. In the era of McCarthyism, truth and paranoia blurred, and Elizabeth Bentley was at the center of it. As the years passed, Bentley's fame turned into isolation. She struggled with alcoholism, loneliness, and the weight of her choices. To many she was a hero, to others a traitor twice over, first for spying for Moscow, then for betraying her comrades. In 1963, Elizabeth Bentley died quietly at the age of 55. She left behind no family, no fortune, only the complicated legacy of a woman who had lived in shadows and then dragged those shadows into the light. In Elizabeth Bentley, we see the paradox of espionage. She was both spy and informant, betrayer and patriot, tool and weapon. Her story is not one of clarity, but of contradiction, a reminder that in the Cold War loyalty was never simple and truth was never pure. When Elizabeth Bentley first walked into the FBI's New Haven office in 1945, agents were unsure what to make of her. She looked more like a schoolteacher than a master spy. Tidy hair, plain clothes, polite speech, yet behind her careful demeanor was a mind carrying years of Soviet secrets. The FBI interrogation process was not gentle. Agents pressed her with questions hour after hour, cross-checking details, challenging contradictions, and testing her reliability. Unlike hardened operatives trained in disinformation, Bentley often spoke with earnest bluntness. She wanted to be believed even when admitting her guilt. She was not the perfect witness, but she was a sincere one, and sincerity in espionage can be more dangerous than deception. One FBI report noted that Bentley showed nervousness, chain-smoked constantly, and drank coffee as if it were medicine. These little details revealed a woman under immense psychological strain. Her life depended on persuading the Bureau she was genuine. Though Bentley gave the FBI valuable intelligence, she soon realized something chilling. Her role was being weaponized politically. The FBI under J. Edgar Hoover saw her testimony not just as law enforcement evidence, but as a propaganda tool. In an era where America was shifting from wartime allyship with the Soviet Union to Cold War hostility, Bentley's story provided perfect ammunition. Her confessions painted a picture of a vast Soviet web inside the U.S. government. It didn't matter that some names she provided were only loosely connected or never fully proven guilty. The narrative itself was powerful. In the shadow world of espionage, facts matter, but in the bright glare of politics, it is perception that wins. Bentley had crossed from secret courier to unwilling symbol. She was now the face of America's fear of communist infiltration. The press feasted on Elizabeth Bentley's story. Newspapers branded her with lurid nicknames: the Red Spy Queen, Moscow's secret woman, and the blonde communista. Some articles emphasized her femininity, painting her as a femme fatale in the mold of Mata Hari. Others mocked her as plain bitter and unstable. This duality reflected the sexist lens of the era. A woman spy was either seductress or spinster, never strategist. She gave interviews reluctantly, often under FBI coaching. In them she described how Soviet handlers directed her to collect secrets, how she passed envelopes in hushed tones, how Golos had guided her. But the nuances of her story were often stripped away. For headlines, one magazine cover showed her silhouette against a hammer and sickle backdrop with the caption, "The woman who betrayed Moscow." The irony, of course, was that Elizabeth Bentley never saw herself as glamorous. She was an intellectual, a bureaucrat at heart who became entangled in espionage, less through seduction than through ideology and circumstance. By the early 1950s, Bentley was exhausted, testifying before Congress had drained her, not just because of the pressure, but because she relived betrayal on every level. She had betrayed her parents' conservative values by becoming a communist. She had betrayed the United States by serving Moscow. She had betrayed her comrades by turning informant, and in the end, she even felt betrayed by the FBI and government, who used her testimony but offered her little protection afterward. In a world built on loyalty and secrecy, Elizabeth Bentley was a woman who betrayed too many masters and was left with no one to trust. She drank heavily. Friends described her as lonely, prone to bouts of paranoia, and haunted by the fear of retribution. Even though she had defected to the American side, she was never embraced fully as a hero. She lived under suspicion of Moscow, of Washington, of herself. Despite her personal struggles, the ripple effect of Bentley's testimony was enormous. Her accusations implicated high-level officials in the Treasury Department, State Department, and other agencies. Some of those accused were later investigated in the Venona Project, secret U.S. decrypts of Soviet communications. While not all of Bentley's claims were confirmed, Venona did validate parts of her story, showing that she had indeed been tied into real Soviet networks. Her testimony fueled the House Un-American Activities Committee hearings, giving legitimacy to fears of communist infiltration. Bentley did not know it at the time, but her confessions would provide the foundation. For the McCarthy-era Senator Joseph McCarthy would rise to power by claiming vast communist conspiracies, and Bentley's early revelations helped create the climate where such claims thrived. She had wanted to serve a cause. Instead, she became the spark for a witch hunt. As the Cold War dragged on, Elizabeth Bentley faded from the headlines. Unlike glamorous spies or flamboyant defectors, she lived quietly, almost in obscurity. She worked briefly as a teacher and lecturer, but opportunities dwindled. Employers were wary of hiring someone with her past. She moved, often seeking anonymity, but the press would occasionally rediscover her, dragging her back into the spotlight. She never wanted. By the 1960s, as she was living alone in Connecticut, her health declined, her alcoholism worsened, and she drifted into near poverty. Neighbors described her as cordial but distant, a woman who kept curtains drawn and rarely spoke of the past. When she died in 1963, there was no state funeral, no honors, no grand recognition, just a quiet burial with only a few remembering how profoundly she had once shaped the nation. As paranoia. Elizabeth Bentley's story resists easy labels. To the Soviets, she was a traitor. To the FBI, she was both an asset and a liability. To historians, she is a complex figure who straddled the murky line between truth teller and unreliable witness. Her life raises difficult questions. Can someone who betrays one side and then another ever truly be loyal to anything? Was Bentley a patriot who redeemed herself, or a self-serving opportunist who sought protection when communism no longer felt safe? And most hauntingly, did her testimony save America from Soviet penetration, or did it simply feed the fires of hysteria that consumed innocent lives? In Elizabeth Bentley, we see not the glamour of espionage, but its cost. She was a woman who sought meaning, who searched for belonging in causes greater than herself. Yet in the end, she was left with nothing but the shadows of betrayal. The Cold War was fought by soldiers and statesmen, but it was also fought by people like Bentley, ordinary fragile human, who carried secrets heavy enough to destroy them.